Buenas tardes, good afternoon, and welcome to our third webinar of the spring, CUNY-NYSIEB. Our topic today is developing and sustaining a high school for newcomers, bilingual approaches. Joining us today is Lindsey Maehlum. She's the AP at High School of World Cultures in New York City. Unfortunately, Ramón Namnum couldn't be here with us today due to a medical emergency. We wish him well. Ofelia García will also join us as a discussant. So we have here today Lindsey Maehlum, AP. She will stop for questions and answers at 2 points throughout the presentation. First, she'll be talking about the context, and then she'll be discussing the systems and supports in her school. Afterwards, like I said, Ofelia García will join in as the discussant. Hi, Lindsey. Welcome to CUNY-NYSIEB. Thank you for being with us today.
Hello. I'm very happy to be with you today. This is me and my principal. Sorry that he couldn't be with us today. Again, he had a medical emergency. So we're with the High School of World Cultures, and what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for students to become bi- and multilingual citizens through structured programs. So even though we're going to be presenting different programs and structures that work for our school, you may find ways to adapt the program to work for your school. And I look forward to hearing about which ways and ideas you have. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the school so you have a background. The High School of World Cultures was founded in 1996. The school specializes in new arrivals. We get students throughout the entire year who have spent less than 6 months in the country. So they're learning English. We call these students English as a new language learners or English language learners. The school is made up of approximately 400 students. This school year, in school year 2015-2016, we have admitted our first incoming 8th grade class. In the past, we received over-the-counter admits, which just means that students who came from other countries into the United States, those are the students who we would take into our school. 80% of our student population are Spanish speakers, but we have over 30 countries and 13 languages represented. Here's a great graphic that we like to show how we create the pathways for our various students. So we get students throughout the entire year, preferably more towards the beginning of the year, and they have an initial interview with the principal. That means that they sit down and they decide what classes they have to take to get to graduation. At this point, we also review their transcripts. So students come sometimes with a transcript and sometimes without a transcript. It really depends on their age and how long they've gone to school in their home countries. At this point, we go over what kinds of programs they need in order to successfully graduate. There are also several assessments that they have to take, including the NYSIEB, which will determine their English language level. They also have to take the Lab R in Spanish if their home language is Spanish. Recently, the Department of Education in New York City has incorporated the LENS, which is an assessment in their home language to determine their literacy and numeracy skills. Based on the data that we get from these assessments, we create a program that's appropriate for the student. This is what a graduation planner looks like. You can see that we have 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. Again, students come in at various points in their academic careers. Sometimes they'll come in as 11th graders and receive transfer credits, and other times they come in as new arrivals and have to start from the beginning. So this tool helps us decide what classes they have to take and in what sequence they have to take them. You can also see on this planner, we determine with the students if they want to be in a bilingual or a dual language program, an ESL, or what we call now an ENL program. We have a CTE program, and if they need special education services. So with our programs, students can also get special endorsements on their diplomas. These are various endorsements that students are able to get. For example, if a student goes into the CTE Culinary Arts program, they can get a special endorsement on their diploma, along with a certificate that says that they are prepared to work in a restaurant. They can also get other endorsements, for example, the biliteracy seal, which we're pushing for our students to receive. And something that you'll see off to the left is something that we always strive for, which is dual language is more of an attitude rather than a program. We really have to believe that when students come into our schools, that they can and will be bi or multilingual when they exit. So here's an example of a diploma with some special seals. This particular student receives special recognition in the content area of science, as well as a CT endorsement and the biliteracy seal. So here are some takeaways from the first section of the webinar, which is we've seen that dual language, like I spoke about earlier, bilingual education, is more of an attitude rather than a program. We have to believe that our students can and will. And that's the teachers as well, which I'll talk a little bit about later. The mission must be very clear and all stakeholders must own it. Not just buy into it, but own it as their own. So when students come into their classes, they're teaching the students and speaking to the students with this attitude of, you will learn the language, whether it's English or Spanish. Bilingual and biliterate teachers are needed for a successful program. It's very important for the program. Teachers also must understand the structures of the program, whether they're speaking Spanish on a day or English on a day, so they can give the students the support they need to become bilingual and biliterate, or multilingual and multiliterate. Also, budgetary decisions are very, very important for successful programs. They're not cheap. So we need to know how to allocate so that we can have those either duly certified teachers, or in some cases, 2 or 3 teachers in a classroom to support the linguistic needs of our students. So I've been speaking very quickly, but we have a quick Q&A session where I can answer some questions if I haven't been as clear. So the first question we have here, what do you think is the most important aspect of the curriculum? Wow, it's a really good question. The curriculum needs to be on a continuum. So I'm going to speak about this a little bit more for the second half of the presentation, but when you're teaching 2 languages, it's not that you teach, let's say we're speaking about English and Spanish, English one day and repeating it in Spanish the next day. You teach one day in English, and then the next day you pick up where you left off in Spanish. So when you're developing a curriculum, it really needs to be on a continuum. You also have to decide for your program what's going to work for you. What classes are going to be in Spanish and what classes are going to be in English. And I'll talk about different variations again in the second half of the webinar, what you can do to make sure that you have successful programs. But you really have to remain consistent as well. The next question, is the lens only in Spanish? No, the lens is offered in many different home languages, and they're continuously working to build that bank of languages. So the goal is to have every home language represented so we know where the students are at. We can't determine how much support a student is going to need until we know how much support they need in their home language. Another question here. How many content classes, like living environment, can the students take in their own language? I probably should have started the program the webinar with the programs, because in a couple minutes, I'm going to speak about the different types of programs that we have, and that really determines how many content classes are taught in each language. But at our school, we have 2 different programs. We have a 2-way and a 1-way, which I will speak about, and they're Spanish and English. So we have classes that are offered in Spanish and classes that are offered in English, and it depends on the program when and how they're getting that content delivered. Unfortunately, we don't have any programs right now that we can offer in other home languages, like, for example, Arabic or Urdu. We also have a huge population of Bangla-speaking students, and it would be great to offer some content area in Bangla or have a dual language in Bangla. And maybe we'll get there someday, but we're not there yet. And so I have a question here. If we could talk a little bit more about the initial interview, absolutely. So when we're doing the initial interview with students, you really want to interview them in their home language so that you can get an accurate answer to the questions that you're asking. So for example, if we have an Arabic student coming into our school, we really need to find an Arabic translator to help us understand what the answers are to the questions. We have a set of questions that we like to ask to determine if students are SIFE, which means students with interrupted formal education, to determine if the students need additional academic supports, which is really important to ask them in their own language. In addition to questions like, what's the last grade level you went to school, we've also found that it's important to know how long during the day students are attending classes, because we've had students in the past that although they've gone to a 7th grade level, maybe they've only gone to school for 2 hours a day. And what was that school like? What were they learning in school? Those are important questions to be asking your student population. Once we determine the answers to those questions, we're able to fill out that graduation planner. So we have a question here, where is our school located? We're located in the South Bronx, and we're a high school, so we're servicing grades 9 through 12. And what is the criteria of getting into our school? The criteria for getting into our school is that a student is an English language learner or is English proficient and wants to learn Spanish. So depending on the program, that's something new to our school this past year. When you're an L, we prefer that you've been in the country for less than 6 months, but again, we're changing that criteria as our programs are growing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation moves forward. And so there's one more question now. How many L's do we have? Right now, our current population is 80% L's, but before this school year, we've had 100% L's come into our school. So the reason why we have 20% non-L's is because they have been passing the NYSISLAT, or the assessment that's given in New York, to determine that they no longer need those services and that they're English proficient. Our students come from all over. We have an 80% Spanish-speaking population, followed by a Bangla-speaking population. But as I mentioned earlier, we have over 30 countries and 13 languages represented at our school. So here I'm going to speak a little bit more about the programs and pathways offered to students. So I have 3 different students represented here. We have one student, Esmeralda, who is dominant in Spanish and proficient in Spanish. So she's really from a Spanish-speaking country. She's from Mexico, and she has learned to read and write in Spanish, and the language she speaks is Spanish. So we have 2 different programs that she could go into. We have the one-way dual language program, which is for Spanish-speaking students to strengthen their Spanish, but also learn English. And we have the two-way dual language program, if she would prefer to go into that program, which is a program where students are either proficient in Spanish or English, and then they learn the target language. So in her case, she's proficient in Spanish, so that program's made up of 50% Spanish and 50% English speakers. She will be this proficient Spanish student learning English, and then there'll be other students in her class that are proficient in English learning Spanish. Our next student, Alexa, her dominant language is also Spanish. So the first language that she learned in her household was Spanish. However, when she went to school, she learned to read and write in English. So she's actually proficient in English, even though her home language is Spanish. So she goes into the TwoWay program, and she actually counts as the English population. So her and Esmeralda could be in the same program, and even though her home language is Spanish, she's really strongest in English. So when we go into other classes, for example, English as a new language, she's not in that, but she's in the class Spanish as a new language, which sometimes confuses people because they think, oh, she speaks Spanish, she must not need help in Spanish, but she needs to learn to read and write Spanish just like her classmates. So we have Redwall, he's the last student. His dominant language, home language, is Bangla. And his proficient language is English. So he's just like Alexa in the fact that he would be good in a two-way dual language program as the English proficient population. And he's learning Spanish because we offer a Spanish-English dual language program. So interestingly enough, he's going to come out of the program multilingual. He's going to be speaking English fluently, Spanish fluently, and Bangla fluently. Also reading and writing in that language. We also have a freestanding ENL program, or a standalone. So if he didn't want to learn Spanish, he could go into that program as well. Although we really encourage students that are proficient in the English language to go into the dual language program. The ENL standalone or freestanding program is really good for students that aren't proficient in English. Because if they're not proficient in English, they really won't succeed in that dual language class because they need one language as a proficient and one as a target. So here's a little bit about the program makeup. Let's start with the one-way dual language or bilingual program. We have courses in English. These courses are English, math, and physical education. They're stars by some of these courses because they're the integrated courses, which means that a teacher pushes into the class to give additional ENL support or English as a new language support. Then we have courses in Spanish. So in this case, we have social studies, science, and Spanish as a home language offered in Spanish. There are no alternating courses in the one-way dual language program. So the students that are in the one-way program are those Spanish students that are trying to learn English and strengthen their Spanish. So they're getting these courses, social studies, science, and Spanish, solely in Spanish. And they're getting English, math, and physical education solely in English. There's no alternating days. Every single day is the same. In the two-way dual language or bilingual program, it's a little different. So we have students like Redwall who come with a home language of Bangla. So we really need to think, what are some ways that we can support them and make sure that they feel successful every single day? So the way that we do that is we alternate instruction. And if we go down to the bottom, we'll see that we're alternating in global and living environment. So one day he's getting global in Spanish with a teacher that pushes in. So two teachers, one that's just there to support his Spanish as a new language. And the same day he's getting living environment in English. So he feels some success. So even though he may struggle through the Spanish because he's learning Spanish as a high schooler, he gets to feel successful in the living environment class. The following day, we'll do the reverse. So he'll get the global in English and he'll get the living environment in Spanish. So when he's getting the English class, there's an ENL teacher that pushes in with the regular teacher who gives additional English support. And when he's getting the Spanish class, there's an additional teacher to push in to give Spanish support. So the courses in English for the two-way or the bilingual program are English and ENL, math, and physical education. The courses that are in Spanish are Spanish and Spanish as a new language. And then we have the alternating classes that I spoke about. The last program that I'm going to speak about is the ENL standalone program. And that's for students who really need to become proficient in the English language. So the courses that they receive in English are English, math, social studies, science, and physical education. And the courses in Spanish are, of course, Spanish. And there's no alternating courses for this program. So let's talk a little bit about perspectives, because these programs, you need to have a lot of supports for many different groups. So let's talk about the students. Learning a new language is very taxing for our students mentally and emotionally. We've noticed that students that come into the program will often get very mentally tired and sometimes even want to give up because it's a very steep learning curve. If I don't speak Spanish, but I'm supposed to learn Spanish and I'm put in a class where everything is in Spanish, it's difficult. So that's why we really try to give supports to students, not only by having another teacher come into the classroom, but also giving them another period in the day where they can have language support. So all students have a class in Spanish and a class in English for the two-way program, let's say. So let's speak about global. They'll have global in Spanish one day and global in English one day. If I'm learning Spanish, if my proficient language is English and my target language is in Spanish, I'm going to get Spanish as a new language support, which means that that teacher is going to go over the vocabulary in Spanish with me that was learned in the global class and learned in the living environment class. So I can start to make meaning of what I'm learning. The same way around, if I'm going into an English class or I'm learning English and my proficient language is Spanish, but my target language is English, I'm going to get ENL, or English as a new language support. And I'm going to get that in global and living environment to really reiterate what the vocabulary is and help me make connections between the new language that I'm learning and the content that I'm learning. So we really need to remind students that it takes a lot of work, but that they'll get there. And what we're seeing now that they've been in the program for a while is that they're getting really excited. They're seeing things in the hallway, they're hearing conversations in Spanish, and they're getting really excited about knowing, oh my gosh, I understand what that means. So that's very, very rewarding for both the students and the teachers and the administrators. Pretty much everybody is rewarding. So next I'm going to talk about teachers. Teaching a language is also a challenge, especially when the teacher knows the first language of the student. Whether the teacher knows Spanish or this teacher knows Arabic, it's very difficult to teach a student in a target language like English or Spanish and stick and stay true to the language. Because we know language learning is very difficult, but it's also important to understand concepts in the language you're learning. For example, if I'm learning about a computer and my teacher tells me, oh, computadora in Spanish, and every time I look at a computer, I'm translating in Spanish, then back into English, it's taking my cognitive resources. I'm going back and forth. But if I can just look at a computer and know, oh, it's a computer, then I'm learning to think, I'm learning to process in that language. Teachers are trained to teach the new language through the use of scaffolds and differentiation. So one of the questions that we had from our teachers was, how do we teach Spanish to the non-Spanish speaking students? That was really a question. And my response to the teachers was, well, how are we teaching English to students when we don't speak their native language, like Urdu? How am I going to teach them English? And the teachers knew through their training, oh, we can use pictures, we can use graphic organizers, we can use kinesthetic pieces. So that was helpful in showing them, oh, you can do the same thing with Spanish too. So if you're teaching a student Spanish, you don't have to translate the word. You can show them an image, you can act it out, you can provide other scaffolds for them to understand what you're talking about without direct translation. And also, we can't forget about parents. Parents are very important, or guardians, in the process of language learning. It doesn't matter which program the student is in, it's very important that they have parent buy-in so that when they go home, they really have the support necessary. What we do is we have parents come in and we discuss the different types of programs at the beginning during that initial interview, but then also when a class is determined for the student. Because sometimes they may come in for the initial interview, we might place them in a program, but then after several tests or assessments, we realize, you know what, there's another program that might be better for you. And we have the discussion with the student, and we have the discussion with the parent or the guardian, and we have them sign a contract. Doesn't mean that the student can't move programs, but so that they understand that there's a commitment piece involved in the program. Again, it's very taxing, so if I'm learning English, it might be difficult for me, and I might go home and I might cry because I don't understand what my teacher's saying in English. And so we really have to train the students and the guardians that it's a process. It's not going to happen in one day, but we're here to provide supports to you and your student. So I spoke a lot about the supports. Here was a little graphic that I created to just remind that every piece here is very important. The parent piece, giving parental support, having parents engaged is very important. For our program, we use each one of these supports as we're running through a month. So, for example, this month, students have been learning about the Renaissance. So they're going to be going on a trip to medieval times, and they're going to see, you know, the food, and they're going to see some of the tournament and have a little bit of fun with the Renaissance. And then they're going to take pictures and bring it back to school and then write about their experience in both the proficient language and the target language. Students will be paired up with their opposite target language. For example, an English speaker will be paired up with a Spanish speaker, and they'll be supporting each other in the other language. So if my native or home language is English, I'm going to be paired up with somebody whose home language is Spanish, and I'm going to write about my experience in the target language of Spanish, and they're going to feel like they need to help me with that, and I'm going to help them write about their experience in their target language, which is English, and I'm going to feel like I need to support them with that. And then we're going to invite parents to the school, and we're going to do a gallery walk where students will have a chance to interact with the language, practice reading what they've written, and engage with parents and students. And they'll actually have a chance to practice the language with other speakers. For example, if I'm learning Spanish, how exciting is it going to be for me to meet a Spanish-speaking parent and be able to explain my experience to them in a way that we can communicate, a whole new way of communication. So it's going to be a really fun night, and we've been able to do this throughout the program. So teachers also need to feel the buy-in. The teacher piece is really providing a lot of professional development for teachers on how to support the needs of their English language learners, training them, again, that it's an attitude, not a program. Your students, not only a program, your students can do it. And the teachers need to understand and believe that their students can do it. And then you're going to see some great results. Also, having teachers participate in, the potlucks, the field trips, is super important. The student engagement piece, going on field trips, presenting, is always a lot of fun. Showing off their new skills, showing off their new language. When you go to the store and you buy a new outfit, you want to show it off. Same with the students. When they learn a new word, they're running up and down the hallways, using the word, and hopefully it's an appropriate one, right? We also need to give language supports to students. That looks like you can give it many different ways, but in our school it's really PM support, PM after school program. So when students need support in a language, they go to the PM school to get support. And this is really because, like I spoke about the continuum, if I'm learning something in English one day and the next day I'm going to Spanish, I need to really understand the days that were not in my home language or in my target language. So I need to go back and really make sure that I'm making those connections. So students are given the support that they need after school, in terms of if there needs to be some reteaching happening, if there needs to be some breaking down of the language. That's very important. We need to also be able to provide students language supports in terms of they might need technology in the classroom, having a dictionary online, an iPad in the classroom, so that they can get some home language support, not translation of entire pieces, but bits and pieces of what they're learning. And that's really very, very important. We always stress to our teachers, what's the most important concept that students are gonna be learning in this chunk of time? And if you had to break it down and say 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, that if they understood these words, they would understand most of the lesson, even if they didn't understand anything else. So if you're doing a science lesson about, molecules, they're going to need to know what a molecule is and really understand the makeup of a molecule. So the words that they might need to know are atom, molecule, electron, neutron or proton, but really going down to the basic backbone of the lesson. Activities are super important in terms of keeping students motivated. We had a potluck for the students, and that was a really great point in our program, because we really saw like a segregation of the Spanish dominant and even the Spanish as a home language versus other home languages, and there was a big separation there. So what we did was we had a potluck where we invited students to bring in food from their homes and something that meant something to them, as well as music. So we had students, eating and enjoying themselves, and it was very low stakes. I mean, they were eating, and in the background we had different music playing, and it was such an amazing experience because we had students from Bengali up there dancing in a different way and teaching, our Dominican students how to dance in that specific fashion, and vice versa. It was a lot of fun, and the students really started to break down those cultural barriers as well. So the takeaways from this section are really that dual language requires a lot of emotional support. We have a guidance counselor, a full-time guidance counselor, and a full-time social worker that work closely with this program, making sure that students understand, again, it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. Commitment is key. You need to have staff members and a vision that's clear, and you need to be committed to it. What is our end goal? How are we going to get there? How are we supporting students in getting to this end goal? And you must consistently revisit these goals. Constantly, coming together, monthly meetings with your teachers. Have we gotten to our language goals? Have we gotten to our content goals? If not, how can we get to those goals? And the program, again, requires support, emotional and socio-emotional support. So now I'm going to take some more questions. I'm sure that there are a lot of questions, especially about programming. Okay. So I talked earlier about the culinary program. Do students in your bilingual program have access to it? So yes, we have a culinary program. It's a CTE culinary program. And the students, no matter which of the three programs they're in, whether they're in the one-way dual language, two-way dual language, or the freestanding, they have access to that culinary program. And the way that we program it or schedule it to fit the needs of the students is by scheduling it as both an elective, but also as an ENL serviced class. So we have a culinary instructor, and then we also have an ENL, or English as a New Language teacher, that pairs up and does integrated instruction during that time. So students are getting the minutes that they need for their language services, but they're also getting an elective credit, and in New York, usually you use those elective credits as the culinary credit to get them to graduate. Okay. You gave an example of a student that speaks Bangla that is in the TwoWay program. Are there students from other home languages in the program? Yes, in the program that we have a girl from Pakistan, and her home language is Urdu. We also have some Arabic speaking students. We hope to grow the program to get some more home languages represented, but at this time, that's pretty much the scope. We also have Spanish as a home language, like I spoke about with Alexa, even though her proficient language is English. What is the role of the standalone ESL class in a successful newcomer program? So the thing about English as a new language and learning a language is that we've seen the more connections that you can make, the more successful the student is going to be. So interdisciplinary planning is super important. So when you're talking about an ENL class, you really want to have a teacher that's connected to all of the other classes of the student. You can do this by having interdisciplinary planning on grade levels. So you can get all of your 9th grade teachers to come together and plan. So then as an ENL teacher myself, I can say, okay, what are you learning about in science? What are you learning about in global? What are you learning about in algebra? And what vocabulary words do you need me to reiterate to the students, or that we need to practice in our class? That's very important. And then you can also work in collaboration in terms of, okay, you're learning to write essays in English, so in my class, we're going to talk about the main idea, and we're going to talk about supporting quotes, evidence, and then how to analyze those. Should a newcomer program assess for math and science? So we assess literacy and numeracy for students. So when they come in, they take the lens, so we know where they're at in terms of their home language reading level, but also in terms of their numeracy skills. Science, we look for what their background in science is when we need to know whether or not we're going to be waiving the living environment exam. If a student comes in 11th grade, we're able to waive some classes, and in this case, Regents exams, which they need to graduate in New York. But other than that, we don't really test for science skills. It's more literacy and numeracy skills. And if the students are scoring low on those, we have to give them additional support, whether it's an ENL class, whether it's in like a set style class or a remedial class where they can go with a teacher that's really able to teach them those remedial skills. Can you talk more about the integrated courses? How do the teachers work together? Do they co-plan? Absolutely. They have to be able to co-plan. That's really the backbone of being able to have integrated courses. If I'm an ENL teacher and I'm pushing in with a content area teacher, I can push in with ELA, science, math, or social studies. I must know what the other teacher is teaching. That way I can create supports, scaffolds, pre-plan activities. That's super important as an ENL teacher or the content area teacher working with the ENL teacher. You must know what's going to happen in the class and prepare where misunderstandings might happen. And that way you can provide students support that will help them not make those content mistakes or language mistakes. Do you also service ENLs with disabilities? If so, how many students per class? It's been very interesting because as a school, we've really taken over the counter students, which means students coming from other countries. And when that happens, we really can't test them to see if they're, or label them, I guess, to see if they have some sort of learning disability. And the reason for that is that New York State and New York City doesn't want to mix up a language problem with a learning problem. So we really like to give students time to learn the language before we're seeing if they need services or not. So usually students are not tested in our school unless teachers see a need for it or their parents see a need for it. And we recently had one student tested and is now going to be receiving special education services. But other than that, this last year has been the first year that we've taken incoming 8th graders. So we did have one student with a disability. That makes 2 students in our entire school of 400 students. So we're not really, English language learners with disabilities, that's just another kind of support that we give to students. So the 2 students that have been classified as needing these services are now working with our special education teacher, and that's like the integrated instruction that I spoke about earlier. The teacher is going into their content area classes and really providing support to these students. Using these programs, what is your success for graduation? Do they graduate on time, or do they need more than 4 years? Fortunately and unfortunately, we're getting students that are coming from various home countries, and the exams, the Regents exams, and the way that our schooling system has been designed is that we're testing and assessing students who have had 12 or 14 years of English instruction. So we're really needing to pack in all these years in 4 years. So we have a 65% graduation rate in 4 years and an 80% graduation rate in 5 years. We know from the data it takes 7 years to learn a language. So we're asking our students to do it in a very short amount of time. I can't tell you what the data is going to look like for our two-way dual language program because that has started this past year. That data will follow within the next 3 years. Great. Okay, another question. What is the recommended maximum number of students in a newcomer class? Well, as few as possible. But enough to interact with one another. We have seen classes of 15 to 20 work really well, but because of budgeting and budget cuts, unfortunately, sometimes our classes are 25 to 30. So it really depends on what you're able to do. If you're able to put your money into teachers and staff, I highly recommend that you do so you can decrease the number of students per class. It also makes a huge difference in terms of individualized attention that they're able to have. We try to max our classes out at 25 to 28 students because although we have the staff, we have a lot of that integrated instruction. So we're not able to have so many solo classes. And since we have 2 teachers in one class, that's double the cost, unless you can find duly certified teachers, which is amazing because they're able to service the content and the language at the same time, which you kind of get like double bang for your buck. What is the lens assessment you mentioned for numeracy? Is it a pre-made assessment? Yes, the lens assessment the Department of Education came out with a lens. So they have created these assessments for literacy and numeracy in the home language of the student. So if I speak Spanish, I'm assessed in Spanish. If I speak Bangla, I'm assessed in Bangla. And they are, I can't tell you all the different languages that the lens runs in, although if you search it, I'm sure you could find it. It's growing all the time. The last time I checked, I believe it was 5 languages that are represented in the lens. How many SIFE students do you have in your program? We have many SIFE students. As I mentioned before, we have an 80% Spanish-speaking population, and the country that we receive most of the students from is the Dominican Republic. And a lot of the programs that the students have been part of in the Dominican Republic, unfortunately, have only run for a couple hours a day, whether or not they've needed to work in the field or they've had something else going on. So they have had interrupted education. Some students have stopped going to school completely, and maybe their last level was 2nd grade, and we're getting them in 9th grade. It's really something that we have to support all students with. 60% of our school population is SIFE, and sometimes it can be really exciting because you're teaching students who really have that desire to learn, and sometimes they're fascinated by the learning. For example, I once showed a SIFE student how colors mixed to make other colors, and they were just so excited. It was fun. Okay, so how do you waive Regents requirements like living environment? There are 2 Regents that we waive, and that's algebra and living environment. In order to waive those Regents, there are different requirements for each. They need to have a transcript from their country, and they have to show that the course in the country is similar to the course requirements here. And also they have to be of a certain age. So for example, to waive living environment, you need to be in 11th grade. So thank you so much for being my first webinar audience. I hope that everything was very clear. I now have the pleasure of introducing Ofelia García.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
Lindsey. I appreciate all you taught us, and very happy to be able to just give you some thoughts, summaries of what we heard today, and just making sure that we got some of it. It's very complex, of course, to do this type of programming for students, but I think Lindsey did a great job of explaining it. I think that one of the major threads that I heard Lindsey talk about is the fact that you have to have some flexibility in the program. She started out by telling you that you have to adapt, that this is what works for them, is not necessarily what's going to work for you. And if you have been at the high school for a long time, I have seen the changes over the time. When they first started a long time ago, in 1996, they were in a mostly Latino community, a Latino community that is changing. South Bronx is changing, and they have increasingly had a lot more students from Bangladesh, from Arabic-speaking countries, from Pakistan, so that they have had to adjust and adapt their program to make sure that they now really help these students. The other issue that comes up is the fact that they have students that arrive at all times during the year, and therefore one has to be flexible with the type of programming that you do. And you've seen her describe other changes that they've made. For example, that they were a completely over-the-counter school, and last year they were able to take in their first 8th grade incoming class. So all of this is changing, and I think that one takeaway that I get from what she has told us is precisely that you have to have many pathways, not just one. And I think that is certainly a trajectory that we have seen the High School of World Cultures take. Another thread is the fact that they pay a lot of attention to students, especially at the beginning. Ramón Namnum, whom I hope is recovering well, does the initial interview, and he asks for support when the students come in with languages other than Spanish. So to make sure that you interview them in their home language. And besides giving them all the tests that we all give our students, an ICETEL, the Lab R in Spanish, the LENS, etc., there are a lot of questions that they pose. There's a lot of dialogue going on with the student and with their parents, the last grade level, and they have said how long the day is very, very important for them to have us information. Another thread that we heard Lindsey talk about is the fact that this is all a process, that she may be able to tell you what they do, but that learning, of course, a language and going through high school in another country is a process. It's a process that takes time. It's a process that takes a lot of support. She said that it takes a lot of work, but that students have to know that they'll get there. And they do this, they give the students this support through many, many kinds of ways, having oral presentations, having field trips, making sure that peers are paired off so that they can give each other support, having the after-school program to really support their language development, making sure that there's technology in the classroom that they can work with, iPads, etc. You also heard her say that there's just not one program, even though, again, at the beginning there was one program, but now they have expanded. They had a program that was English as a new language, ESL, basically, a self-contained ESL program with Spanish as an offering. And lately they have added two kinds of dual language bilingual program. One, a one-way program in the sense that they're all Spanish speakers. But again, as you heard Lindsey say, there is a lot of variance among Latino students. Some, of course, are English language learners, some are not, some are Spanish language learners, many of them are bilingual. The idea is that there is a continuum, and she talked about the continuum, but I want to emphasize the linguistic continuum with which we work, and that's why programs have to be flexible in order to meet the students where they're at. And therefore, they have a one-way program, but they also have a two-way program. The one-way program, of course, it's easier to set up in the sense that basically they have some content in English, some content in Spanish, with support both in English and Spanish when needed from another teacher. The two-way program, in which they incorporate not only Spanish-speaking students, Spanish-speaking students who are learning English, Spanish-speaking students who are quite bilingual, but also Arabic speakers and Urdu speakers and Bangla speakers, and therefore you need to think more carefully about how to give these students the support they need, again, so that they're learning the content and also developing the language. But this is all doable. I think that principals have to make some decisions about budget. How do you allocate resources? I think all of this is important. A word about translation and what we call translanguaging here in CUNY-NYSIEB. Translanguaging is not translation, but it is certainly supporting students and enabling students to use their full linguistic repertoire to, of course, make sense of content. So it's not that it's translation, and you heard Lindsey say that translation is not supported, except at times to make sense of important content so that students do not miss out. So all of this is extremely important to keep track of, and to remember that translanguaging is not just going across languages, but it's thinking about these students as having one language repertoire and being able to then, of course, incorporate their features from this new language to appropriate it. and that is mainly why we don't speak about English being a second language, but English being the students' appropriate language, that it is their language, that they can appropriate their language, and therefore this is extremely important. That is, not thinking about this as the student has one language and then you add a second one, but rather thinking of this linguistic repertoire, this flexible continuum. And again, continuum has been a word that Lindsey started with and I want to end with. This flexible continuum to which you incorporate new features, but that you make your own. So it's not the language of the other, but it's our own language. And I don't know, I think that another thing that Lindsey really emphasized is the fact that teachers are extremely important. You heard her say that especially at the high school, having a teacher who's dually certified is very, very difficult. And so therefore it's more expensive because you have to have a teacher who is licensed in ESL, for example, and the content teacher. But I think that this is something that we have to work with, and we have to make sure that teachers are not only knowledgeable of the content, but also able to be as resourceful as the students. That is, to be a co-learner in the classroom, right? So that when you are working with students who speak Urdu, making sure that you yourself not only teach them English, but that you also learn some Urdu. And I think that this is, as she said, good for all the students. The ability not only to taste food and to experience culture and dance from the other cultures, but also to incorporate some of the languages that we hear around us. And I'm very happy that you tuned into this webinar. I want to remind you that the webinar will be archived on our webpage and that you should check our webpage periodically for updates. Shortly you will be receiving an email, and we want to hear what you thought of this webinar. We would really appreciate it if you take the online survey. And again, we want to remind you that next Monday there's another webinar. We have changed the time. The time is 5 to 6. I hope that that is a better time for all of you. We require registration, so we please ask you to register for that webinar. That webinar will be given by Christian Solorza from Bank Street College with some of his colleagues at Bank Street College, who are also New York City teachers. And that webinar will be on a blueprint to incorporate translanguaging in dual language bilingual education. So muchas gracias for joining us today, and thank you very much, Lindsey, for all your words, and hope Ramón is doing better. Thank you.